Ah, the Sturer Emil, a vehicle so cool that the Germans only made 2 of them. And to follow their footsteps, so will I. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a double feature model showcase video for these 2 1/35th scale German Sturer Emil heavy tank destroyers. The 2 models that are in this video are built for my own personal collection and are not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that info would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. These 2 models here are built, strictly speaking, out of the box. Although these 2 examples may look identical, there are some subtle differences between the 2, and these are features that are supplied with the kit. In this video, I'm going to be going over all of these features, all of the differences, areas on the builds to watch out for, and last but not least, I'm going to be giving these 2 models here a thorough in-box review. So stay tuned, because clearly there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around these 2 models. And this vehicle here is the 12.8 cm Selbstverliefert auf WWII-01H, or thankfully and more conveniently known to everyone as the Sturer Emil. The Sturer Emil, just like with the Dicker Max, is one of those really interesting German designs where it has even an interesting slang name to it, which, by the way, in case anyone is wondering, it's German for stubborn Emil, was a heavy tank destroyer that was designed by Henschel for the German military in the early phases of World War II. The vehicle is actually a very interesting one in that it was designed by Henschel in 1941 and was basically utilizing components from a heavy tank design that Henschel was working on that didn't get adopted. Oddly enough, that design eventually led up into the Tiger I, but the firm had a bunch of hull components and suspension components lying around, so they decided to basically do what Porsche ended up doing, oddly enough, with the Ferdinand and the Elephant, was to take these components and turn them into a heavy tank destroyer. Like with many other Panzerjägers that were designed by the Germans during World War II, the Sturer Emil was going to incorporate a very high caliber, high velocity main armament mounted in a turretless type vehicle. This is something that the Germans were basically the pros at doing during this time period, because with the casemate design, you get to have a very high caliber main armament, but without the added complexity of designing a turret, which includes just the turret design itself, the rotation ring, the hull, all of that good stuff gets eliminated if you're rolling with a casemate. Of course, the downside with the casemate is that you do not have nearly as much mobility with the main armament getting it on target. However, for the type of role that this vehicle was going to be used for, the need of a turret was deemed to be not that necessary. For the vehicle's main armament, it was going to utilize a Rheinmetall 12.8 cm Canon 40 L61 main gun. This is basically a reworked design of the 12.8 cm Flak 40. The Flak 40 was just like with the Flak 36 being a very high velocity anti-aircraft armament. The idea is that with the amount of velocity needed to shoot at a bomber flying at high altitudes, this is going to give you ample amount of velocity to knock out enemy armor at long distances. And this is again why the need for a turret, or really for that matter heavy armor protection, wasn't going to be that necessary. With this type of a design, you could just stay far back, well out of the range of the enemy, and be able to pick off any enemy tank that you deem fit. Of course, in order to do this, this vehicle was going to be paired with an excellent set of optics, which of course, the Germans are definitely not foreign to creating excellent optics. For the vehicle's propulsion, it was going to utilize a Maybach V6 HL116 engine. The vehicle in total came in at around 35 tons, which is fairly lightweight compared to a vehicle of this size, because the vehicle came in at about 31 feet in length, making it for a fairly long platform. The vehicle, as I touched upon before, was based on a earlier heavy tank design. However, in order to fit the main armament in place, the hull was lengthened, which again is something that the Germans would revisit when they would develop other vehicles of a similar platform, namely the Nashorn, as well as even the Jagdtiger. The vehicle had a crew of 5, and for secondary armament, there really isn't none to be spoken of. Basically, you just had some infantry around the vehicle in order to protect it from counterattack. Supposedly, the vehicle could have been armed with an MG34, however, I don't see any mounts or cradle-type systems for that type of a unit to be fitted in place. And if anyone can recall the story of what happened with the Ferdinand, you can see that the Germans quickly came to the conclusion that that's something that would need to be revised. Only 2 of these vehicles were ever produced, and they were presented to the small mustached man. However, they were never approved to go into production. As for the 2 production units, they were sent to the Eastern Front and participated during that campaign. The 2 vehicles were given the name Max and Morris, and they again served on the Eastern Front until 1943, where one of the vehicles was destroyed and the other one was actually captured by the Russians. Although the Sturer Emils were a design dead end and had a very short service life, that doesn't mean that they didn't have any successes on the battlefield. When the one vehicle was captured, it apparently had 26 kill rings painted on the barrel, so clearly it was able to do the job. As for the fate of the only captured Sturer Emil, well, that actually is one that has a positive note. You see, unlike many other weird and unique tanks that were captured by the Allies, where they met their fate to a cutting torch or even worse at a shooting range, the sole surviving Sturer Emil is still with us today. It is currently housed in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, and in my opinion, it's one of the collection's crown jewels, which is something that's really noteworthy to say on account that that museum is probably the best tank museum on the planet, and some of the other exhibits include the Karl Morzer and the Mouse. So to be in that company, it's definitely something that's very noteworthy. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when these 2 models were first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here are the models at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing not 1 but 2 1/35th scale Trumpeter Sturer Emil kits. Just like with the other double feature model showcase videos that I've posted on this channel, these 2 have been sitting in the stash for many years. These 2 kits were procured from Tower Hobbies back in, I want to say 2006, 2007 or so, and have been sitting in the stash in the same location ever since. You can tell by the layer of dust and crud on the surface here. And this, by the way, was the one on the bottom. So let's see how the second one pans out. I'll use my other hand as a gauge. Yeah, this one, the dust is so impregnated on it, it's not even just rubbing off when I move my hand on it. So needless to say, I think it's high time that we get these things started and built, not to mention out of the way. Back to the models over here. Like I stated before, they were picked up back in 06 and 07, but these kits themselves were fairly new to the market at that time, being released in 2005. At the time of release, these kits were one of the hotter items that were on the market, and a lot of people were talking about them on the various online communities of the period. And this particular kit here is actually also interesting in terms of the company, because it was really at this time where this company started to really transform themselves and become the company that we know of them today. At the time these kits came out, the Trumpeter Plastic Model Company was a very different company compared to the way we know it today. During this period, this pattern of vehicle wouldn't be the type of subject matter that Trumpeter would have been working in, so it was very unique in that regard. Also, the Trumpeter Plastic Model Company was, at the time, a newcomer or a relative newcomer to the plastic modeling community. Of course, Trumpeter is a Chinese-based plastic model company, and I believe they have their founding in the mid to late 1990s, but it wasn't until 1999 and 2000 was when their kit started to be imported into the US. The first time I encountered a Trumpeter kit was in the Phoenix Plastic Model Catalog. I opened the page one spring day, and there was an entire spread of kits from this new company. The kits that they were making were all different variations of the Chinese Type 59 main battle tank, which of course is the Chinese copy of the T-54 and T-55. Trumpeter went ahead and did almost half a dozen, no, more than half a dozen, about 20 or so of these type of vehicles where they changed out and did the vehicle basically as many configurations as you can imagine. What was also interesting was that the kits were extremely affordable. These kits retailed anywhere between 13 to 15 US dollars, so this was something that was really interesting and really enticing at the period. When these kits dropped, they were a complete smash, and they were extremely popular because T55s at this period were extremely far and few between. If you were a T55 guy, the only options available were really the rendition from Eschi as well as Limburg. Yeah, that's the type of environment we're talking about here. The Tamiya kit wouldn't drop for a number of years later, so they were able to get their foot into the door and really be able to get a good footing in the industry. These kits were far from perfect. They were originally made from an ABS type plastic, so gluing them together was a bit challenging, specifically if you used the Testor's Red Tube model glue, as I did. But the detailing on them was sufficient for the period, and again, they were able to fill a void in the hobby, and they were able to really grow from that. Fast forward to the early 2000s, Trumpeter really began to improve the quality on their tooling and also on the kits that they produce. They continued to produce several renditions of the T55 and T54, but they also decided to sprout out and work on other types of vehicles. This would include the Swedish S-Tank, as well as also several versions of the M1 Abrams. What made these kits, the second gen kits, great was that the plastic was now polystyrene, so yes, you could assemble them with traditional cements. But at the time, Trumpeter was basically just focusing on vehicles from that era, so they were primarily a modern tank plastic model company. It wasn't until the era that we have here, which is the 2005-2006 era, was when they broke away from that. The Sturer Emil was one of the first World War II German vehicles that they produced, and this completely took everybody off guard with their pants down. When Trumpeter released this kit here, they released it with a few other German World War II vehicles. Two noteworthy ones were both based on the Panzer IV chassis, one of which is the support vehicle that goes with the Karl Morser, while the other one is the Dicker Max. If the Dicker Max name should sound familiar, specifically if you're a fan of this channel, well, that's because there was another company who was working on a Dicker Max kit at the same time, and that company, of course, was Dragon. Dragon, as we know, basically, for that time, owned the 1/35th scale German tank market, so this kit here was a direct competitor to their version. So, as you can see, the release of these kits here made quite a splash in the armor modeling community. And of those kits that I just mentioned, which by the way, all of which are fantastic builds, the Sturer Emil here, in my opinion, is definitely the crown jewel. If you grew up in the 90s, this vehicle here was one of those grail vehicles. This was one of those vehicles that you would always see in some obscure photograph on the internet or in a tank book, or you would see some pictures, some grainy, low-res pictures, by the way, of the real sole surviving example of this vehicle in the Kubinka Tank Museum, and always wondered, wow, that's a really cool-looking vehicle. Man, I would love to build one of those or have one of those in my collection. And unfortunately, just like with the case with many of these weird vehicle kits out there, it eluded the plastic tank kit companies for the longest period of time. So Trumpeter stepping up to the plate with this kit here was definitely a very, very welcome addition to the marketplace. Prior to the release of this kit here, if you wanted a 1/35th scale rendition of the Sturer Emil, the only options available would be to roll up your sleeves and scratch build this thing, or you're going to spend some time trying to find some strange, weird, obscure, hole-in-the-wall type full resin kit from some garage company, which is rare and equally as expensive. Both of which have concerns on their own, either scratch building it outright or working with a full resin kit, neither of which are as convenient or as easy to assemble as something made in polystyrene. So with all of that, you can see why this kit here was a very welcome sight to be had. Which, by the way, at the time of filming this video, this kit here is still as relevant today as it was in the mid-aughts when it was first released. Because as far as I know, this kit is still the only option available in 1/35th scale, in polystyrene no less, for a Sturer Emil. Because these kits here were tooled up in the mid-2000s, you'll see that once I crack the box open, the level of detailing on them is going to be excellent, and the quality of the molding details are also very well done as well. The quality of detailing is going to be on par with other kits from the era, from companies such as Dragon as well as AFV Club. Well, before I could go ahead and start going into the box art graphic design, let me just remove one of these kits off the table since it is the exact same kit, and I believe this one here has the cleaner box art. Starting with the box art, here we have the Sturer Emil driving on a flat Russian plane. Note the smoldering T-34-76 in the background. The setting is very well composed and also is very well executed by the illustrator. The vehicle is nicely detailed. Note that all of the details are present on the illustration. And overall, the setting is simple but definitely effective. The smoke of the T-34 is definitely well thought out, and you can see the quality of the illustration of the T-34 in the background is also very nicely done. The illustrator for this is this individual over here, which I believe the initials are WV. The date is 2004. The vehicles came out in 2005, which is not uncommon when companies hire an illustrator to do their box arts. One thing, though, that is interesting that I remember was that when these kits were first announced, the box art was different. The setting was identical and the vehicle was in the exact same location. However, the difference was with the color of the vehicle. There is a rendition of this particular box art where instead of the vehicle being all Panzer Gray, it actually had a dual tone camouflage pattern where it consists of mostly Dunkelgelb with the Panzer Gray airbrushed on in a camouflage stripe type format. This is something that I never particularly ever seen in person, but there are pictures of this box art floating around the internet. In fact, I'll even throw a thumbnail right here in the corner of what the box art originally looked like. This is something that I personally found surprising, as when I purchased the model on the website, the thumbnail was the rendition with the camouflage pattern. So imagine my surprise when I cracked the box open to see this version that we have here. I'm not sure if the bigwigs at Trumpeter told the illustrator to revise the illustration or not from the camo to the plain Panzer Gray version, but it is something that I did want to touch upon because it's something that I haven't really seen anyone ever even mention. The remainder of the graphic design is typical for Trumpeter kits from the mid to late 2000s period. And of course, Trumpeter would change their graphic design patterns quite a bit over the next few generations. But for this era, this is basically what you're going to see on all those kits that I mentioned before. Here we have the title of the vehicle in this green sans serif typeface with the white stroke around it, the name Sturer Emil, and the Trumpeter logo is right there in the upper right-hand corner. Towards the bottom of the box, we have some more information right here written in Mandarin, 1/35 scale, as well as all the other little bits of information telling you about the kit. On the side panel here, we have the thumbnail of the same illustration we saw on the front. Trumpeter kits of this period had this red gradient type setup to it, where we have the information here for the company, as well as the kit number, and the other information that I touched upon before. Same thing, of course, on the opposite side. On this panel over here, we have some snippets of an example of one of the built models. Basic history of the vehicle, written in English as well as in Mandarin, as well as also some corporate information. On the reverse side, it's pretty Tamiya-ish, where we have a nice little illustration showing the side, the front, and the rear portion of the vehicle with the markings that are present. Of course, on this side over here, just some warnings as well as a few more corporate info. Opening up the box reveals the kit contents. Right here on the top greeting us are the instructions as well as the color sheet, which is nice that they give you a nice little illustration here showing the two options that the vehicle has markings for. Of course, there were two Sturer Emils in real life, and with this kit here, you can build an option of each, which fortunately, me having both of these kits, it's pretty safe to say I'm going to be building one in each configuration. The illustrations themselves are pretty good. I believe this one here might be the same one that's found on the side tab of the box that I showed before. And it's just on the front face. Here we have the instruction manual, which is quite nicely done. We have, your typical CAD drawing affair. The quality of the instructions look to be really well thought out. It's on par with, Tamiya or Dragon. Well, let's see if it's on par with some of the Dragon kits because, Dragon kits in the past have had some errors in their instruction layout, namely on some of their black label kits, but with this one here, it seems to be looking just fine. Of course, this vehicle does have full fighting compartment interior detailing, which we will definitely be touching upon as this video goes on. And, you know, it's pretty much what you see is what you get. Starting over here is going to take us to the two largest components of this vehicle, which are the upper and lower hull sections, not to mention the fighting compartment. Here you get to see the details found on the surface. All of the parts, by the way, are molded in this gray plastic, and this was something that was a change for Trumpeter. Before these kits here, the Trumpeter kits were trying to emulate something like you would see from Tamiya, where the color of the plastic would be either green, drab, or a tan type coloring, but from this era onward, they switched to this gray type plastic. This is also the same type of plastic that you'll see on kits from Hobby Boss because, well, Trumpeter is basically, or I should say Hobby Boss is Trumpeter's sister company, and the tooling is basically Trumpeter. But anyway, back to the quality of the molding here, you'll see that everything is very nicely molded, clean and crisp. We have here some molded in well beads, as well as little fasteners found in their fastener wells. On the fender work, we have the German diamond plate rendered out. And of course, it would be easier to see if I go ahead and open up the packaging. So here you get to see the diamond plate in clear focus, along with the fender supports. The lower hull components also have some nice detailing rendered in, like the bump stops as well as the swing arm mounts, not to mention the reverse sides of all the torsion bars. And again, as you can see, everything is very nicely molded. On the fighting compartment, you get to see that same level of detailing carried over, namely with the well beads as well as with the little tie-down straps, which are found along the leading edge of the top. I believe these are for strapping on a tarpaulin, if I'm not mistaken. The back, we have this really cool geometry going back here, where we have this little hatch. It's very unique for the Sturer Emil. On the inside, we have some interior detailing in the form of support straps, as well as rigidity braces. And note, they go ahead and mold on several suggestion points for all the little bits of details and accessories that need to be fitted to the inside portion of this area. Hopefully it comes out on camera, but definitely you'll be able to see it as the video goes on once everything gets fitted in place. There are a few little points I noticed on the sides from where I believe there must have been sprue areas located and they just snipped them off prior to packaging. It's not too intrusive, something that's really easily just polished away with some sandpaper. But again, more info on that as the video goes on. The first runner out of the lot is this set that we have here, and this appears to be the fighting compartment interior, where we have the floorboards, as well as the inner frame, which I'm pretty sure is going to be used to support the main gun, which I'll be touching upon as I dig through the runners. We have the exhaust manifold. It is a two-piece assembly, not uncommon on many kits out there. Engine grills, supports, tools, you know, basically all the stuff you need. It's got those Panzer III side doors right over here, and some sections of spare track. The spare track are very nicely rendered, as is, again, the rest of the vehicle. One thing that is unique, though, it looks like that they went ahead and molded the spare track brace to the spare track itself. That's something that you don't really necessarily see. Generally, these are molded separately to give you a little bit extra detailing, but again, the pieces are well rendered for what they are, and it's going to be interesting to see how they paint and secure onto the vehicle. The next two runners are duplicates because they are clearly the model's running gear and suspension. So here you get to see the swing arms, which of course are molded separate, which is always a nice touch. We have some bump stop detailing, the idler tension detailing, the rear idler itself, as well as the sprockets. Note they are very nicely rendered. Here we have the final drive, and also the pseudo Tiger 1 style dish wheels with all of their fastener detailing integrally molded in. And again, the quality on them is very nicely executed. Here you get to see the return rollers right there. Again, same level detailing found on them. The next runner consists of the mantlet, the barrel sections, as well as several components for the interior. Note the mantlet is going to be a multi-piece assembly, which always leads for excellent detailing. You have to see the fasteners found on the face portion. The barrel is a two-part assembly. Again, something that is very typically seen on these model tank kits. I believe there are several options out there for aftermarket metal barrels of one flavor or another, but for this one here, I'm pretty sure the kit ones are going to be suffice. Here you can see the other interior bits of equipment, such as the canteens, the holders, potato mashers, and of course, no World War II German tank interior would be complete without a set of racked MP40s. Last two runners consist of some more interior components, which would include some ammunition racks, which for an open-top casemate design like this one here, it's going to be a major focal point on the interior. Note here we have the shells all lined up. They look to be a one-piece installation. We have the casings. They are molded hollow, which is a nice feature. We have a complete round right here, and look at the size of that thing. That'll definitely drill a hole in just about any tank you could think of. As well as some other components to finish off the mantlet. Last but not least, we have some Mp40 pouches to go with the two racked Mp40s that I touched upon before. The last runner consists of the last of the main armament components. So we have the breech, which is, again, several components, which will make for some very unique geometry. We got the mount, recuperators, and the main portion of the receiver itself. Just like with several other open casemate design tanks, such as the Hummel or the Nashorn, you will have quite a few sub-assemblies in a two-part assembly. So seam work is going to be something that you're going to be dealing with quite often on this build. But again, for something like this, this always comes with the territory. The very last component in the bottom of the box are the tracks, and yes, these tracks here are single-piece vinyl, which is fantastic because, as we know, I am a huge fan of tracks like this on the channel, and Link can definitely go and take a hike. The single-piece vinyl tracks are very, very nicely rendered. You can see they have excellent phase detailing on them, and the interior detailing is equally as good. Not surprising for a kit designed in 2005. Here you can see the inner hinge detailing of all the links, as well as the guide horns that are molded hollow. The material of the tracks is flexible, but it's not overly flexible, and the stiffness is not something, to me, that looks like it's going to be a concern where it can potentially break parts. So that's always a good thing on single-piece vinyl tracks. There are several options out there in case for some reason or another the individual does not want to use single piece tracks for reasons that escape me. However, if you are one of those individuals, there are some aftermarket solutions out there, one of which are from Hobby Boss, which again is kind of funny because Hobby Boss is, you know, Trumpeter's sister company. And from what I've seen on the internet, those tracks do have a good rapport to them. So that is something to consider if for whatever reason you want to roll with the workable track link route. But for these two builds here, you know me guys, I'm sticking with the single piece vinyl. The last thing towards the bottom of the box are the decal sheets. These are water slide decals. And if I could get this little wrapper open, there we go. You can see what they look like. The little protective tissue paper out of the way. These are just standard water slide decals on blue backing paper. The decals appear to be decent quality. I haven't really had any problem with other Trumpeter kits in the past with their decals, so this one here, I'm not, anticipating any issues, but who knows? We'll see how that pans out as the build goes on. Of course, since there are two renditions of the Sturer or Emil, you will have enough options on here to build either one of two types of vehicles. And here are the models going through their construction. This one over here is a little bit further along compared to this one, which is just about ready to catch up to this example. As like with all of these vehicles with an open casemate design, or even just an open turret design for that matter, you do have a lot of interior details that are best painted off of the runners as opposed to when fully assembled. Also, just like with lots of other vehicles with some kind of partial or full interior detailing, you really get to appreciate it at this point here prior to the units being fitted in place, because once they're mounted in place, they kind of just get absorbed by the interior space, and it makes it really tricky to go ahead and film. So, as I always mention in these videos, I tend to go ahead and walk the viewers at some of the paintwork at this time prior to the model being fully completed. So here we have the completed example, or the partially completed example, with the fighting compartment fully detailed out. You can see the breech as well as all the other recuperator details that are present. All of the details you see on these two examples are stock out of the box with no mods or additions being made. The interior equipment plugs, or I should say secures to their allocated locations with no real problems to mention. I will say though that on the shell racks, they are a really snug fit, so much so that I actually have to polish the bottoms down with some sandpaper just so that they snap into their corresponding locations. But outside of that, the pieces were fairly straightforward with their assembly. Also, you can see the lower portion of the compartment. One thing I do want to mention at this time is that if you pay attention to the floorboards, you'll notice that they are painted in brown. On the German vehicles, or I should say on many German vehicles, the floor panels are actually made out of wood planks, and to replicate that on the model here, I just simply weathered it in that following format. So you'll notice that the brown is poking out through the gray paint to simulate the wear of all of the walking up and down these surfaces over here. So you saw what it looks like when secured to the interior portion of the casemate. Let's look at the actual paintwork on the pieces themselves. These ones here are painted in the exact same manner as the ones I just touched upon. The interior consists of magazine pouches for the Mp40 or the Mp38. We have 6 potato masher type hand grenades, 4 of these canteens, 2 gas mask containers, some sort of oiler type can, and a holster. The set also supplies you with 2 Mp38 or Mp40 SMGs, and they are nicely rendered. They have all the appropriate detailing found on them. One way to improve the look of them is, if you'll notice on the stock sections, I replicated the 2 examples here to look like red Bakelite. This is something that I have mentioned in a few other open, or I should say interior German tanks like the Hummel that I recently completed, and I mentioned this for the same reason. On the Mp40 or the Mp38 family, the stocks were made out of 2 types of Bakelite. You had black and you also had brown. So for this one here, to give it a little bit extra color, I went with the brown color. On this version of my Sturer Emil, I went with 2 brown Bakelite versions of the Mp40, while on my other example here, I went with one version being with the brown and the other one being with the black. Just a way to get some little extra color to the inside, and also to give the models a little bit of extra differentiation. Of course, this is something that's totally up to the builder's discretion, but it's just another thing to keep in your inventory in case, you want to add a little bit of extra character to your build. Some other interior details that are noteworthy is this little frame over here, which is for the fighting compartment. It's also the main armament mount. It's a nicely detailed piece, and again, I just really like the way the piece was designed and rendered out. Of course, it was painted and weathered into the format that you see here. One thing that needs to be added still to this piece are these 2 seats, or stools I should say, that get fixed to these 2 locations. Those have been weathered and painted, and they're just waiting to be installed, and probably will be done after the filming of this scene here. You can see those stools, hopefully in the light that we have here. They're really hard to come by, but you see that round surface on, or that round object right there? Those 2 are the stools that I am referring to. This box structure here, I believe, is the engine, and it has some nice louver detailing found on it. It is a multi-piece assembly, but the pieces go together very well, and no other seam work is required. It was a nice tight fitting piece. You do want to take your time on it though, just to make sure that the pieces line up appropriately, just to avoid any mishaps of like there being a gap or 2 and something that could develop when you set the piece aside and the glues aren't fully set yet. So outside of that, the pieces are really easily assembled. On the carriage over here, you'll notice that at this time it's not fully assembled because obviously it's best to paint everything separately, otherwise you will be doomed to have areas of unpainted plastic, which doesn't help anybody. So on the carriage, again, it goes together pretty well. It's basically along similar lines as the Hummel or a few of the other Nashorns that I've built in the past, or even the M40 self-propelled gun, but it goes together pretty well. On the optic over here, it is just painted with a paintbrush. It is painted a different color. The optics are black, and the little eyepiece there is made out of a brown leather on the roll unit, so it's just simply replicated here. A little drop of clear lacquer is going to be applied to the lens just to give it a little sheen, so that if you look on the inside, it looks like that the optic is nice and shiny. The other side, nothing really much to talk about over there, but it was obviously weathered with the same format as the other unit, so once everything is fully assembled, it blends in perfectly. From the carriage takes us to the main rear section of the armament, and the unit is a multi-piece assembly, and each of these pieces consists of their own multi-piece assembly, which boils down to a lot of seam work. The seam work is easily polished down with some average modeling techniques, i.e. sandpaper, super glue, possibly red putty if need be, but if you take your time with it and you're careful, you'll be able to polish down all of the seams to the way we have it here. One thing that is interesting to point out is with the breech system, it's kind of unique how Trumpeter went with the design of the piece. It's not one solid chunk of plastic, and it's not even a 2-half assembly. It's like a 3 or 4 piece assembly for one reason or another. And because of that, you will have quite a few seams on this to contend with. They're easily addressed, and once taken care of, it makes for a nice seamless look that we have here. But again, this is the type of thing you want to take your time with, and you can't just rush along and build the whole thing and then be like, oh, I'm going to paint it once it's fully assembled. If you do that, you're going to be a fool, because you will not either miss areas that are still have seams present, or you're just going to have paste or areas without paint on them. On the recuperators, of course, a little swipe of silver paint is added to those areas, as they would be chrome, as when the piece gets, recoils backward. These pieces are indeed left in the white. The breech block itself is in another component that's left in the white. It's just painted to the format that we have here, weathered, and once done, it gives a nice little color contrast to the piece itself. You can model this with this piece either in the open or closed state, which is quite customary on a lot of these patterns of vehicles. The main elevation gear over here, I went ahead and painted it in the silver color, because obviously you really wouldn't have too much paint in this area, as it kind of needs to operate. And it's also typically well lubricated. The remainder of the barrel sections are assembled, but obviously they are going to be mentioned and discussed after the fining compartment is completed and secured, and the barrel is really one of the last things that get mounted to this model. But of course, more info on that is to come. Back to the interior sections, here we have the radio. The radio is decently rendered. The only thing to improve it further is just to paint the unit appropriately. So the surrounding box section on these German radios are flat black. The face of them is panzer gray, but I've seen them also in a few other colors available. If you look online at Real Surviving Examples, you do have a few options to pick from. Because the whole vehicle is gray, though, I went with the earlier gray color just to keep things with some continuity. The housing, of course, would be part of the vehicle itself, so it's painted with panzer gray and weathered as such, and then all of the gauges and dials are just basically painted with some simple painting techniques. Some white, a little black, a few drops of gloss here or there. It's really all that's required. The next thing to mention are the main shells themselves. And here you can see them still on their runners, or in this example, I should say. Just like what I was touching upon before, you do have the rack, which is part of the vehicle, but it is integrally molded in. So when you're painting these pieces, you want to paint them carefully. The shells themselves are painted with the field gray and then are weathered to the look that we have here. There are a few options out there of painting these shells. I believe some may be yellow. It depends on the type of shell itself, but I went with the unit being all green or field gray on this one just to keep the look that you see here. The copper sections are the bands, and on the real units would be copper or brass, depending on the unit in question. And just again, this is simply just carefully painted with some precision painting with a precision paintbrush with some copper paint. The heads themselves are painted silver, as from the examples that I was looking at. And the last thing to mention are the floorboards on this example over here, and just like I mentioned before, these are wood on the real unit, and with this one not yet installed, you get to see the weathering really up close and unhindered until all the remainder of the equipment gets fitted to the inside of the model. At this point, the model is going through its painting procedure, and you can see that the first coat of primer has been applied. I did want to take one moment to point out something unique that I found in not just this example of the Sturer Emil kit, but the other one as well. When the unit is painted on these two locations here on this side, and on these two locations here on this side, you will see a weird little mark which kind of looks like a fingerprint on the surface. However, apparently it must be a part of the molding, because again, the exact same thing was found on both examples of these kits. If the camera could zoom in closer, hopefully this comes out on camera, but aside from a little bit of discoloration, there is some surface texturing going on in these two areas where they're really small little pits or bumps. Again, it kind of looks like, you know, you have a fingerprint and you stunk it on the side of the model when the paint was still wet. This is something that you definitely want to take care of, and fortunately at this point of the build it's not something that's a problem. To fix this, I'm just going to hit it with some wet sanding, and I'm going to use my fine sandpaper that I've touched upon in a few other videos. A few passes with the wet sanding method, and then it should be okay. I could just hit it with a second coat, and then everything will blend in perfectly, and the model could progress with the remainder of the paintwork. Which you can see on this example here, the sanding was completed. The surface is completely smooth, and all traces of those marks have been eliminated. Once the surface is totally prepped, from here the model can commence with the remainder of its paint and completion work. Starting with the model suspension, all the components you see here are stock and went onto the model without any sort of problems whatsoever. The Sturer Emil wheels are just like the other interwoven wheels found on the Panther and the Tiger, and because of that there is a format that you need to install, and they do get installed on in layers. Fortunately, the layers are fairly simplistic, and if you take your time and follow the instructions, you should be having the wheels get installed without any sort of problems. One other thing I want to mention about the wheel installation involves the track. Obviously, you always install the wheels at the end of the build after the model's painted. I don't care what any other people say. Specifically with a vehicle with interwoven wheels like this one here, yeah, good luck trying to paint those sections, you know, once everything is glued in place. It's not going to happen. So, regardless, you need to install the wheels on at the end of the build anyway. However, when you are doing the wheel installation, it's best to do the first couple layers and then install the track. Once the track gets fitted in place, the remainder of the wheels go on, and it just seals everything off, and it makes the track installation go by 10 times easier compared to trying to manhandle the track over the wheels once in their final assembled format. While we're still on the wheels, I might as well mention the weathering and the paintwork. The Sturer Emil wheels are basically like the wheels on a early production Tiger 1, but in a smaller format. And unlike the Tiger, you have rubber-rimmed top rollers, and also, interestingly enough, one of the few German World War II tanks that have a rubber-rimmed rear idler wheel. All of the rubber tire details are nicely molded onto the surfaces. However, as one might imagine, it is a very meticulous job to go ahead and thoroughly paint every one of these rubber tires. And again, this will make things even easier to do when they are not installed onto the model, specifically, again, before the model is fully painted and weathered. The paint job, it's again standard. If anyone has ever built a Tiger 1 or a Panther, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's one of those things that's tedious. In fact, it was probably the most time-consuming aspect of the entire build, outside of just waiting for glues to dry, but for paint-wise, the tires were the biggest hurdle. It goes by pretty quick, but once it's done, it really does leave for some nice results. For weathering, I went with my usual worn-out bearing type format, where we have the oil leaking out of some of the bearings, and you can see the starburst effects going on, as well as with some of the oil seepage and effects that go along with that. Of course, being an ECA build, the center portion of the hubcaps are Zerk fittings, and they are painted in red, as I commonly mention on these videos. Moving to the track, the kit-supplied single-piece vinyl tracks were utilized, and they are excellent. They have great detailing on them, like I mentioned before, but here's what they look like once mounted to the vehicle. No other assistance was required. I didn't have to glue the track onto the wheels like you do on a Panther or a Tiger or anything like that. the track just slips on into place, and once it's installed, it's good to go. Just like with the main road wheels, the top rollers here are also one of those things where you want to install on layers. First layer goes on, then the track, and then the final layer goes on, sealing off the look. You can still try to get the wheels on in place with the track already fitted, but it's much easily done in a segmented format like I just mentioned. As for the track timing around the sprocket, again, it fits absolutely perfectly. And so much so that, honestly, the need to replace the track isn't necessary in my opinion. There are aftermarket tracks out there for this particular pattern of vehicle that are workable and they are excellent, but in my opinion, they are just not necessary. Unless you're specifically trying to do something with the build, like you want to have it rendered with the track knocked off or being worked on or something along those lines, perhaps then a workable option would be a viable one, but just for a standard build, it's really not that necessary. Now, will it enhance the look of the build? Yeah, I could see it definitely making the build that much more enhanced, but is it really important? I'll leave that up to the builder's discretion. When it comes to painting and weathering the track, I went with my usual format. Like I always mention in these videos, if a tank has single-piece vinyl tracks, you don't want to use spray paints to paint them. Spray paints may have a negative chemical reaction to the material and can actually cause some harm or other detrimental effects that you really want to avoid. The paint that I use is just Tamiya acrylic flat black that is applied via the airbrush, and once the paint sets, I go ahead and add some washes to it and dry brushing, bring it to the look that we have here. You'll notice that on my tanks I don't tend to rust my tracks, and this is because the material that these tracks are made of were actually very rust resilient, and you have to weather in context. These Sturer Emils were literally brand new when they entered service and when they eventually ended up getting out of service because one got destroyed and the other one got captured. So the tracks having a rusty surface on them would be anachronistic. On top of that, these tracks in general just are really, really good and are resilient to rust, unless the thing has been sitting outdoors for about 50 some odd years or underwater, or if it caught on fire. Outside of those parameters, these tracks really don't tend to rust very often or really at all. So rendering them in this format here is really the best way to go. The track segment mounted on the front is a single all-encompassing unit where the track and the mounting bar are integrally molded as one piece. This makes it a simple installation because it just drops directly into the appropriate location and it's good to go. However, this does open up some complications in terms of painting. Because the bar here is integrally molded to the track, the builder really needs to pay attention, and they need to make sure that the paint is being applied on the bar here in a really meticulous way. And what I mean by that is that the paint has to be at just the right consistency. If it's too runny, it's just going to bleed off into the track hinge segment and it's going to cause a mess, and it's going to require a little bit more time and other techniques in order to clean it up. But if it's properly executed, the look will be seamless. On the rear portion here, and this is really my favorite aspect of this vehicle type, is with the weird geometry we have going. So the rear portion of the fighting compartment has these nice interesting angles to it. We have a rear door right there on the back, and we also have these two large covers that are in these two locations. Directly below that, we have the exhaust manifold. The exhaust manifold is a multi-part assembly, and it's quite similar to what you see on vehicles like a Panzer IV with the way the pieces get assembled. If anyone's ever built any of the Panzer IVs that are on the market from one company or another, you'll know exactly what I'm referring to. The piece does have several seam sections to take care of, but once they are polished away, the piece has a very nice look to it like you see on this build. Of course, with the way the piece is painted and weathered, it's quite typical for my builds, and I'll touch upon that towards the latter half of the video. Outside of the exhaust manifold, we have the other interesting details back here, like the little step ladder that's right there on the back, which is a nice touch. It really makes entering and exiting this vehicle that much more easier. And we also have some interesting idler tensioning systems right over here where they are just an exposed fastener, and this is a bit unique compared to other German tanks where this fitting here is underneath an armored cover cap. But again, this lends itself to the prototype nature that this vehicle is. One other cool fitting to mention about the exhaust manifold is that the tailpipe section is a hollow molding, which is fantastic, and it's one less thing you need to do as a builder with a Dremel bit in order to hollow it out to give it a little bit more realism. While I have the two examples here on the table, this leads us to one of the differences that the kit does offer you. This version over here is rendered in this format where we just have the two step sections without any sort of details added on them, while on this one over here, at some point they decided to add on this little box which contains, I believe, smoke grenades, and this is a fitting that's found on other German tanks of this period. So things like the 38T, the Panzer III, and the Panzer IV from this period would have had the same type of detail fitting on them. This component is supplied with the kit and is nicely rendered out of the box. And again, it's one of those features where it pays to have two examples of this model in case you want to have it like I do over here, since you can't make up in your mind on which one you want. At the end of the day, it's best to have two. Before we depart from the rear area, I just want to mention one other thing about the rear doors. You'll notice that on the outside portion, we have a little handle that's right there on the one corner. Well, on the kit, these details are present. However, they are integrally molded on as a little thin blade, much along the lines as you see on some Tamiya kits. For the model over here, I simply just amputated the molded in blade, drilled out these two locations here with a pin vise, and then with the aid of some floor wire, I was able to fabricate a brand new handle, adding it in place, thus improving the detailing found on the part. Of course, a simple model like this is something that always generally helps the look of the build once completed. If you do not have the small drill bit or the type of experience to do a procedure like this, perhaps this is something you might want to sit out and just roll with the piece with the stock configuration. On this type of model here, it's actually really important to know exactly how far to drill into the surface of the door because of the vehicle having its full interior. If you accidentally go all the way through, obviously this is going to cause some issues with the hole being found on the inside. So for this one here, if you have the expertise, go ahead and add the modification because again, it'll really improve the look of the build. But if it's not something that you have the skill set for, you can just set this one out and just leave the piece in its stock configuration. Carrying along takes to the tank's side tin work details, and there's nothing really much going on over here. The tank's tin works are actually quite sparse compared to other contemporary German tanks, but here you get to see on this section here all the Pioneer tools. These of course are the kit supplied units and are very nicely rendered for an out-of-the-box offering. The pieces have all of the tool handles and clasps integrally molded in place, and they have the little German pattern of latch mechanism, which is generally something that tends to be overlooked on molded tools in 135. The only thing the builder needs to do is to pay attention on what parts are metal, what parts are wood, and what parts would be the straps and would be painted the same color of the vehicle. One thing that I found interesting about this pattern of vehicle is that there are no external or even other interior mounted jacks that are present on this pattern of vehicle. But oddly enough, in lieu of the jack, we do have two jack blocks that are found on either side of the vehicle. The jack blocks, just like with the tools, are very nicely rendered out of the box, and the only thing the builder needs to do to bring them up to standard is to simply just paint the components accordingly. Directly behind the jack blocks takes us to the cleaning staves. Of course, this is a bit of equipment that would be important for a vehicle of this type with a barrel this long, and the staves would be stowed in this section over here when in their disassembled format. The staves, like on all German tanks, will be found in this type of format where the rods are made out of wooden poles and then the end connectors would be brass. In order to paint the components, I simply use the same format that I mentioned in all the other videos where the wooden sections are painted with wood coloring of one flavor or another, but the end connectors are just painted with a little swipe of gold or brass paint. This is really all that's required to give a little bit of extra color pop to the model, let alone giving some little extra added detailing that requires almost no other effort from the builder. Moving to the bow of the model takes us to the driver section, which is this area over here. The section is nicely detailed, and again, what you see is what the kit offering supplies you with. Of course, with the periscopes, a little swipe of gloss black is what I use to replicate Panzer glass, but again, this is something that I generally mention on all my builds. The other thing to mention is with this other blister that we have right here on the opposite side. This is another option that the kit gives you where you can render this model with this configuration with the extra what looks to be a deleted crew member section, or you could render it in this option over here that has the blister absent, and then there's just some kind of a weird axis panel in its place. In order to add the blister, you do need to drill out some holes that are found on this section over here, but these are very well labeled with the instructions as well as with the molding itself. This is facilitated with a pin vise with a small little Dremel bit, and after a couple seconds you'll be able to have the holes present on this area over here, and the piece is just a single molding and drops directly in place. Once it's in, your piece is good to go. Moving up further takes us to the main armament, and this is the kit supplied barrel that was showcased earlier in the unboxing section. The piece is a two-part assembly, which means of course there will be a seam to contend with, but the seam work wasn't anything that was out of the ordinary and was pretty much, again, cut and paste as what is seen on many other models from the past, present, and undoubtedly future periods that you will be seeing kits rendered in. The seam work was polished away with some thick super glue, a needle file, and some sandpaper, and after a few minutes of some hand polishing, the final result is what we have here. There is an aftermarket barrel on the market that's made from turned aluminum, and perhaps if this is something that the builder thinks they might want to add to their model, this is another thing, just like with the tracks, that can help and assist with the build. Is it necessary? Again, best left up to the builder's discretion. From the barrel backward takes us to the mantlet, which is a multi-part assembly. It goes together very easily. Nothing really much to mention over there. And then that brings us to the two spare track segments that we have right here on the front section of the fighting compartment. The track, again, goes on without any sort of problems, and everything indexes appropriately as the kit is quite well engineered. Continuing our way rearward takes us to the fighting compartment detailing. And this was something that I went over earlier on in the video, but now that the models are completed, you really get to see what everything looks like in its final form. As I mentioned earlier, the interior detailing is very well thought out, and once all of the fittings are added to their appropriate locations, it really gives a whole lot of life to the inner portion here of the vehicle. And for a casemate vehicle like this here, the interior is always one of the main focal points of the build as a whole. The main armament, again, is also very nicely rendered. Once everything is painted and weathered, it just blends in with the remainder of the kit's detailing. One other thing I want to mention is that the breech is sliding quite a bit. It is not glued on in place, and it does have some rough animation to it, so in case I want to render it with the breech in the open position here, or in the closed position, these are two options that are available with this model without the simple need of just gluing the unit in place. Although when it comes time for moving it around, it tends to shift around a little bit, but that's something I could definitely live with. The next thing to mention, and maybe hard to get in focus, is the antenna base. Here you can see the antenna base with the wire fitted in place. The wire is just a thin little piece of floor wire that I commonly use on my tank antennas, and was mounted in the same format by drilling the section out with a pin vise a little further, which will allow the wire to fit in place in a more thorough manner. The antenna base itself is painted with rubber black, as the real one is rubber. The wire is painted in flat black, but the little section right over here you'll notice is painted with a little swipe of gold or brass paint, which again is a feature that I always mention in these videos. And that's basically it for the details, and this brings us to the paint, the markings, and the weathering. For the paintwork, the Sturer Emil is going to be a tad bit limited compared to other German tank options that are out there. Because these vehicles only saw service at a very early and brief period of the war, you're not going to be able to have the option to paint them with some very elaborate camouflage schemes. However, of course, creative licensing is a thing, and if you want to do you, rock on. You know, you could throw a late war splinter or a octopus bubble pattern on one of these, and for all intents and purposes, it'll probably look really, really cool. However, if you're more or less looking for a more accurate version of the depiction, then you're going to be a bit limited compared to, again, some other types of vehicles. For the Sturer Emils, they were mostly just left in Panzer Gray. However, there is a photograph of one of these vehicles with a camouflage pattern of one color or another. Some people have cited that they're just Panzer Gray with yellow painted over it, and others claim that they're yellow with green or brown, and there's always an argument between the factions. But again, welcome to the internet. For me personally, I always felt that the Sturer Emil looks the best in the all monocoat of Panzer Gray, like you see on these two examples over here. There are just some vehicles that just look very sharp in overall Panzer Gray, and the Sturer Emil, in my opinion, is definitely one of them, which is why I rendered it in the format that you see here. The color is my own shade of Panzer Gray. I've used it on a number of builds that are found on this channel. And to get the weather effects that you see here, this was done with a mix of washes, filters, and then dry brushing. For the sun fading washes, I actually have two different colors on these two examples, where one of the vehicles was painted with a diluted flat white, while another was airbrushed with a diluted cream color. And once everything is said and done, the two colors look almost identical, to the point where even myself, I have trouble picking out which one was which, but I think I know which one is which. And if anyone wants to guess, let's call this one here with the rings Sturer Emil A, and this one here Sturer Emil B, and let me know in the comment section which one's painted with cream and which one's painted in white. And I think I know the difference, but it'll be interesting to see, what anyone out there has to say about that. Regardless, the colors both turned out excellent. I really like the way the sun fading turned out, and the chipping and the dry brushing always just seals the deal on these pieces, and they always look excellent once done. The markings are the kit supply border slide decals, and the kit does supply you with two options to render this vehicle, and again, both options are found here on the table. This version has the kill rings as well as a ghosted cross, while this one here is ringless, but we have a more traditional German iron cross in this area. Both have the crosses on the rear section here, only this one again is ghosted and this one isn't. And then we still have the same type of unit marking present on the other locations here on the vehicle's hull and fighting compartment sections. The decal quality itself is excellent. They went on without any sort of problems and adhered on with the VMS matte varnish in a totally streamlined and problem-free manner. And again, I always recommend the VMS matte varnish, and for this model here, it definitely helped out with sealing the decals to the overall finish. One last thing I want to mention about the Sturer Emil is its overall size. This is actually a pretty large vehicle, even in 1/35 scale. I mean, here's my hand for reference, and this vehicle here was actually tricky to get on camera, specifically with the two paired side by side. So it goes to show you just how big this model is. For some size comparisons, here we have a Hummel self-propelled howitzer, and is pretty much dwarfed by the Sturer Emil's overall length and size. Also, to put things in perspective, here we have a Jagdpanther. And even with the two vehicles lined up rear tinwork to tinwork, you can see just how much longer the Sturer Emil is in comparison. Not to mention the barrel overhangs still past the main armament here of the Jagdpanther. And the Jagdpanther isn't anything to sneeze at. The Jagdpanther is actually a very large vehicle in its own right, but next to the Sturer Emil here, it's definitely on the shorter end. Of course, it would be really foolish to go through this entire video, specifically at the point where I'm talking about vehicle sizes, and not mention or make a brief cameo of the one, the only, the Dicker Max. Which again, I will still say that the vehicle is the only military vehicle whose name sounds like the name of a porn star, but I'm digressing. As for the two vehicle types, obviously they are very closely related with just the overall design of the vehicles themselves, the time frame that they were produced in, and also the time frame that they actually saw service with the German military. The Dicker Max is really nothing more than just a miniaturized version of the Sturer Emil. And with the two side by side like this, it definitely has the feeling of the "don't ever talk to me or my son ever again" meme more than any other vehicle pair that I could think of. Well, maybe outside of the M41 and the M47, or the M5 and the M4, but in terms of these two vehicles here, yeah, that's definitely something that rings true. At the end of the day, I couldn't be any happier on how these two models turned out. If there was ever a perfect build from start to finish, it would be these two examples over here. And for lightning to hit not once but twice in an inning, yeah, that's something that's actually quite noteworthy. I mean, the builds were basically perfect. Nothing got broken, nothing got lost. Everything that could gone right did. So at the end of the day, I am a really happy camper. Not just with the build experience itself, like I just went over, but also the subject matter is something that, like I mentioned earlier in the video, was something that I always wanted to have an example of in my collection. And having these two examples in this condition in my collection is definitely something that is long overdue for me, and is one that I greatly, greatly appreciate. Which brings us to, you guessed it, skill level and recommendation. These models here are very nicely engineered. However, I really can't recommend them to a beginner due to the complexity of the fighting compartment interior. This is something that's really not best left for someone who's never touched a plastic model kit before, but it's really more or less something that's geared to an individual who already has about half a dozen or so kits under their belt. And by this point there, you're pretty much going to be into the verge of an intermediate builder. An intermediate builder shouldn't have any problems with getting the models built and having a pretty good experience with the overall construction. Obviously, if someone is an experienced builder, they could tackle one of these models without breaking a sweat. The overall quality on the kits are excellent, the engineering is also nicely done, and with these two attributes, this does open up the realm for some extra detail components to be added to it. There are several aftermarket components out there in terms of workable tracks and even sets of photo etch that can enhance one of these models past the condition that you see here. However, in my opinion, it's not really necessary because of the original quality that the kit does give you. But if someone is looking to enhance one of these models further, the addition of those components really couldn't hurt the build at all. But of course, something like that is best left up to the discretion of the builder. Where this model gets really interesting is with recommendations. And first and foremost, a no-brainer is going to be anyone who's a fan of World War II German armor. If you're a fan of what I like to call the German Zoo, the Sturer Emils here are an excellent addition to your collection. The vehicle is a cousin of the Tiger One, so if you are a fan of the Tiger One family, the Sturer Emil here would definitely be a welcome addition indeed. Another person who I'd recommend these kits to would be anyone who's an avid fan of the open casemate tank destroyer type vehicles that the Germans were legendary with utilizing during World War II. The Germans had quite an assortment of vehicles in this configuration. Such examples would be the Nashorn, the Hummel, the Marder, the Dicker Max, for instance. If you are really into collecting those wide range of vehicles, I really don't need to finish this sentence on how great the Sturer Emil is to add to that collection. On a similar note, if anyone is a fan of building and collecting oddball or limited production or just prototype vehicles, either be it World War II or just in general, obviously the Sturer Emil is another model that ticks all of those boxes. On more of a conventional type collector end, if you're the type of person that likes to work on dioramas, the Sturer Emil is an interesting choice to use as a vehicle because of its open casemate design. Because we have all those nice detail components found on the interior fighting compartment section, this lends itself to some excellent diorama possibilities. Either be it as a prominent role in an action type scene, in a park type scene, or possibly even in a knocked out type setting. I'm pretty sure if someone is creative enough, they could easily come up with a very unique way to display this vehicle in their next diorama. Finally, the last person who I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who's suffering from, well, best way to put it, tiger fatigue, or, you know, just general melancholy in terms of model staleness. You know what I'm referring to. If you've built a dozen and one variants of the Panther, the Tiger, the Sherman, for instance, and are looking for something a bit new and refreshing as opposed to just a different spin-off of the same old, well, the Sturer Emil is definitely something I cannot recommend enough. It's very different, but eerily similar compared to some of the other vehicles that I just mentioned. And again, I really personally dig the subject matter, and I think so will the type of person who, again, has already built 4 or 5 different versions of the Jagdpanther. And with that, that wraps up this double feature model showcase video for the 1/35th scale German Sturer Emil heavy tank destroyer. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of these 2 particular models, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.